So from a broad perspective that we had just now from David, we're going to get a little more, I guess the word is focused, where we have three very distinguished speakers who's going to talk a bit about their work and maybe further develop ideas across three of the ideas that come out. We're going to start with the public and the arts. The public here, I just want to point out that there was a lot of discussion when I invited the speakers to talk about public and public spaces. The public here, for my own definition, really ranges into the different publics, different communities of interest, of special interest, to public spaces, architecturally, geographically, psychically, and of course intellectually. Not to mention, of course, the emotional side of it. So let me just quickly do an introduction of our speakers that we have today. From my left is SHAWN CHUA from Singapore. SHAWN is a researcher and an artist based in Singapore, where he is engaged with the archives of the necessary stage. His research and teaching has focused on the ethics of discomfort, embodied archives, and uncanny personhoods. He is also currently teaching at the LaSalle College of the Art and at Singapore Management University, and he serves on the Performance Studies International Future Advisory Board. And then we have KOK HEng LEUN, who is the nominated Member of Parliament as well as the Artistic Director of Singaporean theatre company Drama Box. Alongside directing 60 plays, Heng Luan is also a strong believer in engaging the community in his works to promote critical dialogues about the world we live in. Short as it may be here, there's a lot more that I think he will share with us later on. Last but not least, from Australia, we have Rachel Swain, Director and Dramaturg of Intercultural Dance Theatre and Performance Researcher with Marrugeku. She's the founding member and co-artistic director with Yawuru dancer and choreographer Dalisa Pigram. She specializes in creating platforms for emergent, indigenous and intercultural choreographies and dramaturgies, and in facilitating intercultural and trans-indigenous practice-led research projects to redefine contemporary arts practices. So what happens today or for this roundtable is I will invite each of the speakers to talk a bit about their work or some of the ideas that they may want to discuss for about 5 to 8 minutes if they like. And then after that we open it up to a discussion, followed by then opening up further to the floor. Sean?
Hello. This is on. Okay. It's on, right?
It's on, right? Yeah.
Okay. So before I begin, I just want to put it out there that I usually speak quite quickly, and I just had 2 cups of coffee. So if I get a bit frenetic, just like calm me down, okay?
Hold the mic for you. I can do that.
Oh, no, it's fine. Okay, let me just... How does this work? So I don't use a window. Where is it? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I guess what I'll be doing is I have kind of put together a provisional framework of sorts. I'm not so much talking about a specific work, and these are my kind of recent thinking about works as tours as performance and performance tours, and the recent kind of burgeoning of these kinds of works, right? So I'm calling this framework rough guides. And I'm thinking of roughness, and I'm trying to think about notions of roughness through the works I'm going to speak about. So I'm calling it rough guides on one level because these are like really preliminary ideas I'm working through. But secondly, the notion of roughness as something that is discomforting, that is incommensurable, something that is kind of contrary to the notion of smoothness, the smoothness of simulation or the smoothness of certain kinds of experiences. So Of course, the notion of tours. I'm thinking of tours in a kind of etymological sense of the turn as well, right? So, which comes from Old French turner, and I guess most of us are familiar with like discourses about in happenings, in influxes, in situationism, about the notion of bringing and even Brecht, right, about bringing theatre into the streets. For me, I'm not so much interested in those notions of crossing thresholds to make things more real, but I'm more interested in the turn, right? The kind of frictions that are necessary that makes moments of the tour become uncanny. So I'm more interested in the turns that happen as a kind of result of these forms of frictions. Okay, so the first work that I'm going to speak about, of course, and these are, the works I'm going to speak about today are all found, I mean, they were all made in this year or last year. But of course, there are precedences to these kinds of walking performances or mobile performances, right? But the first one I'm going to talk about is State of Motion through Stranger Eyes. So State of Motion was a kind of performance, no, it's not a performance, it's a tour, installation tour that was designed and developed by the Asian Film Archives. And the part that I'm going to be talking about is this tour that happens in 5 film sites in Singapore from across different films that have used Singapore as a kind of landscape upon which different kinds of narratives are kind of projected upon. And so the notion of Stranger Eyes is trying to capitalize on, of course, the kind of uncanny lenses through which we think about spaces in Singapore, right? This is actually a shot from The Wild Eye, which is one of the films that's being referenced. So, okay, they call it an exhibition tour, and basically at each of these film sites, there is a kind of, they would invite an artist to respond to the site and to the film and design a kind of provocation, right? And, sorry, I can't really see this. I'm just going to leave this up here for a bit so you can see how they're kind of pitching or framing their experience, right? Cinema is rife with strange encounters where films serve as records of collisions between people and places. So already I think the notion of frictions begin to come up, right? Collisions. It's not so much about trying to assimilate these different kinds of narratives and imaginaries, but to produce this notion of what I would call roughness. So what was very interesting for me about this experience was that at the start, before you go on this tour, you begin at the pavilion at National Library Board, right? And they would screen excerpts of each of these 5 films before you actually go on a tour. And this is, for me, a very important entry point or initiation point for the audience participants. So I'm just going to show you a very quick clip. So this excerpt is from Paulo Cavara's The Wild. Okay, hang on. Paulo Cavara's The Wild Eye, right, which was made in 1967, and it comes from the genre of Mondo film. So these are kind of pseudo-documentaries that tend to be quite exploitative and sensationalist, etc. And so what Paulo Cavara is doing here is he is kind of responding to that genre of films by kind of incorporating those kind of aesthetics. So I'm going to show you bits of the excerpt that was shown.
It's hard. Its heart will burst at any moment.
I can't stand to see that poor animal die.
Then shut your eyes. Now listen, Barbara. You're already part of my documentary, and you should be in the rest of it. You won't appear all the time, of course. You would play the part of a straight-laced Anglo-Saxon woman who was always being shocked. At the same time, she's falling for the so-called lure of the Orient.
You've got it all worked out, haven't you? You're chasing after me, just to make use of me.
In a certain way, yes. You, for example, are a kind of object that can be made use of in a number of ways. Making love, companionship, perhaps, as a character in my film. Of course, you'll have to leave your husband.
My husband, at least, treats me like a human being. I can think of nothing more degrading than becoming an object, as you say.
Stop kidding yourself. But listen to me. There's nothing you want more than to be degraded.
Of course, they go through Haw Villa and all these various film places in Singapore, including Hong Lim Park. Okay, so this is a sequence that I want to show you. Hang on. Scroll back a bit.
Enough! Finish! Stop shooting. We've got a good scene.
I would never have believed such a thing. What a way to cure the sick.
You fell for it?
What do you mean?
Didn't you realize that almost the whole scene was faked?
Faked? And what about all those people being beaten? Weren't they drug addicts?
Barbara, come on, don't be naive. The only real thing about this scene was you. And even that was too much. Barbara, reality is boring. Lies are entertaining.
There's not enough light there.
I would show you the entire film, but we don't have time for that. But it's brilliant. So what happens here that's very interesting is that because the audience participants start the tour by watching these films, it kind of initiates you into a particular position that you occupy, and you begin to relate to the environment almost as if you were an extra on the film set as well, or rather the real environment, quote unquote, the actual environment rather, begins to be imbued with this kind of cinematic layer, right? As we go to those places afterwards, and so this begins the first kind of friction that happens, right? The friction between the actual and the real. I mean, the actual and the virtual. And when I talk about the virtual, I don't just mean the kind of like cybernetic forms of virtuality, but also the virtual as in the contrasting forms of imaginaries that surround the space, right? And the actual kind of, so it's a brilliant, very reflexive moment that happens in this film that comments on our experience later in the tour as well. Okay, so I want to very quickly just talk about some of the works that were the kind of artworks that were created in response to the film, right? So one of which is Godwin Kueh's Cover and Concealment. So this is one of the locations at the Golden Mile Food Centre, which is along Beach Road, which is also the Army Market. And this was in response to the film by Shohei Imamura's In Search of Unreturned Soldiers in Malaysia in 1971. What he did was, so when we arrive, this is our first destination, and when we arrive at this place, we are let off the bus and we are told, okay, so the artwork is concealed somewhere within the space and you have to find it, and you've got 10 minutes. And so the things that we didn't know what we were looking for, right? And so that becomes a fascinating moment where the collision really occurs, and you're kind of engaging with the space in a way where you're wondering, oh, is this part of the artwork? What are these denizens? What are these extras performing there? And especially when you start going to the third floor with the vendors selling all the wares, right? So of course the work itself was these series of banners that were hung. So you can see the banner that's hung there. So they're kind of hiding in plain sight. But the banners themselves, have these kinds of contradictory messages and rhetoric, right? Take cover behind the screen, kind of military metaphors and languages as well. So the notion of extras is something that's quite interesting for me, because I think usually when we think of these kinds of participatory works, we tend to associate a kind of like emancipatory politics around it. That you are therefore have the agency to move around, right? We confuse mobility with the kind of, we think of passive sitting audiences as, we think of sitting audiences as automatically passive somehow. And if you're made to run around, you're therefore more participatory and more liberated, right? Which anyone who has participated in those kinds of works would know that just because you run around space doesn't mean you're more engaged or somehow have structural agency in a work. So the notion of, so Bourriat here kind of responding to De Boer's notion of society of spectacle says that, we now are in this society of the extras, where everyone finds the illusion of interactive democracy in more or less truncated channels of communication. I mean, there's a lot more to unpack about here, but I don't want to confuse my time, waste my, we'll talk about it in the discussion later. Okay, so what's... Calm down. Okay. Another work, I'll come back to State of Motion, but in this year's Singapore International Festival of Arts, there was also a lot more of these kinds of interestingly participatory or interactive works, works that kind of shift the dynamics of what it means to consume, or what it means to be an audience, what it means to be a spectator, right? So specifically as part of their open series, one of the works was a commission of filmmaker Raja Gopal, who was adapting Bali Kaur's Inheritance into this film called Lizard on the Wall. In this work, audience participants are kind of, you experience the work as an extra, basically. So you go on set and he's making that film, right? And you participate as one of you are actually part of this screen. So you enter into this filmic world. It starts with a kind of, it starts at theatre works, and you're kind of transported on this bus to a secret location. So depending on which day you go to and depending on what scene is being filmed that day, your experiences will differ. So what's interesting about the guiding process is that it is partly ethnographic as well, because this is led, on my day at least, it was led by one of the actors, or she was playing the part of the narrator, I believe, and she would kind of initiate us and talk about, how many of you are familiar with the Punjabi wedding, and then kind of talking about, what the kind of, it's like a kind of crash course, right, on the kind of cultural world that we're going to inhabit, and then we would kind of put on the costumes. And that's a moment that's slightly problematic for me as well, about this ethnic costuming that happens. But another discussion that will be opened. But I think what was interesting for me was the moment that was most interesting and slightly problematic for me was the kind of fetishization of authenticity that's happening in these kinds of works, right? Because when we talk about tours as well, there's a lot of privileging of the authentic, of the real, right? We're going to experience a place that you wouldn't have access to, and you're going to get an insight into the process of this filmmaker. And there was this wonderful moment where, Raja Gopal would turn to us and say, you guys have been waiting for a long time, right? But you are the real stars, right? And these actors, they are the extras. You are the protagonists of this film. And we were playing the wedding guests, right? In the finale of the film. And so that rhetoric, that language of talking about how, this is the authentic experience. I mean, that's something that I've been trying to work through as well. Okay, this is bad. I've kind of prepared a whole... Okay, I'm just going to skip through on these narrative stops of my detours, okay? Coming back to State of Motion, one of the works was by Chun Lin, and she was responding to Wild Eye, which was the film that you saw. I wanted to bring in this work because she initially proposed that this work would happen at Hong Lim Park, right? And so they received the license from the National Parks Board, but actually...
Sorry, Sean, I'm going to have to quickly stop you there and give us a bit of context, especially for our Australian audience,
Okay.
the significance of Hong Lim Park and Speaker's Corner.
Okay, so the Hong Lim Park is one of the few spaces in Singapore where you are allowed, actually now with... the only one. The only place in Singapore where you are allowed to voice your discontent and your, although it has to be first approved, right? And then you get the appropriate licensing. So it's a kind of,
Sanctioned democracy.
another discussion there. But what was very interesting that happened with this work was that before, I believe it was quite shortly before the actual exhibition happened, the license was revoked because the film that she was responding to dealt with issues of the Vietnam War. So it was not her work itself. Okay, so this is the work, the sculpture that you see. This was what she proposed. It would kind of degrade with time, right? To interacting to the sculptural with the weather elements, etc. So what ended up happening was that this work was placed in the National Library Board, in the National Library, Central National Library in Bugis, where we started, rather than at the Speaker's Corner. So what happened was the audience were let off on this stop, and we kind of saw the absence of the work, right? And that for me was another moment of thinking about frictions, right? And thinking about the tour. What are the frictions that are happening between the kind of bureaucratic what's the broader conversation that's surrounding this discussion about public spaces as well? What are the parameters of these spaces? How do we experience these cases, and who gets to decide the rules and establish these rules about and parameters of the public, right? And thinking about that in conversation with, on the other hand, the private experience of the tour, right? The private experience of the tour, meaning that the private experience of the tour that is kind of circumscribed by the performance or the narrative of the performance, and then the kind of ruptures in between, right? What happens what happens? How do you deal with rogue audience members, like audience members that are drifting about? Like, for example, in this work, right, the people who weren't looking for the banners and decide, I'm just going to like have a drink instead, or like people who refuse to engage. Okay, so this notion about space also reminds me of another work by Spell 7, Kinda Hot. So this was in 2000. I think I got the date wrong. I think it's 2004 where they first moved into Cabal Road, and they wanted to, which was along Little India, and they wanted to propose a kind of tour that guided people through this space of Little India. It was designed for 6 people, and of course this was ultimately revoked because of licensing, right? Because there is a rule in Singapore about, and I think that's a very important part about thinking about public spaces in Singapore, because you can't avoid what are the kind of regulations that govern public space, publicness and public performances, which I'm sure Heng Leun has much to say about. But anyway, so with this particular work, so that there is a rule that says that any kinds of performances cannot have audience interaction that exceed 15 minutes, right? So in the end, they didn't do this, but they decided to create another work called Desire Path that was involving a kind of audio tour instead. And a very interesting coda to that story was that ultimately they received a grant from Singapore Tourism Board, right, to kind of further develop that work. Okay, I am running out of time, so I won't speak too much about this, but the other 2 works I want to bring out was a comparison of this work by Open House about Holland Village, where again it takes the form of a guided tour.
Sorry, you need to have to again explain a little bit about Open House.
So Open House is a kind of so they are known for creating these artistic interventions in sites, usually domestic spaces. With this iteration called Holland Village, there would be 3 different tours that were happening. You could go to it was the Hakka Cemetery. and tour the sites. But what was interesting for me about the dynamics of these works was that that there was a kind of modular structure that was happening. They wanted to privilege the intimacy that was happening. So each group would have, I think, about 5 to 6 people involved. And what was most fascinating for me about those tours was because OH Open House has a kind of tradition of making these kinds of works, and a lot of the people who come back to participate in these tours are also people who had initially volunteered their houses for the kind of site-specific interventions that they've done previously. So I realized that there was a kind of community that was being generated. So most of the audiences who were joining this tour weren't like coming in on cold, right? It wasn't like the first time they were engaging with these works. They were they were already experts to varying degrees. So what was quite refreshing about this tour was I noticed, at least in my group, people were volunteering and intervening into the narrative of the guide to offer their own expertise, their own experiences of Holland Village, their own understanding. So that kind of friction with the usual kind of linearity in which we think of scripted tours was a kind of very robust and fascinating one. And then I wanted to contrast that with the Singapore Heritage Festival, right? Which is also, beginning to learn or kind of riff off these kinds of performance tour like capitalizing on these kind of experience economies, thinking about what happens with the kind of commodification of authenticity, etc. So Caldecott Hill, very briefly, is this place where the Singapore media broadcasting place is, right? And it's very heavily guarded. Usually we have no immediate access to this space. And so with the Singapore Heritage Festival, this Caldecott Hill is now, I believe, largely defunct because they've moved to a new campus. So one of the specific works that was happening was, again, a tour. But this time the guide was a senior broadcaster. He was someone who was working in media corps, basically. And so he was kind of offering his own insights and guiding around this place. So here, the fictive dimension is not so much, it's not something that is being explicitly addressed, right? But I think where I want to lead us to with all of this and thinking about roughness is, I think the kind of propositions that I want to make is to think about frictions is that moment of reflexivity that happens, right? How do we think about frictions as disruptive? So this was actually a quote from James Fries in his book, Reframing Immersive Theatre. He says, "The friction between design and experience affords the combination of distance and escape that facilitates genuine participation. Glitches, awkwardness, and processual incompatibilities are, in short, a defining part of immersive participation rather than that which must be eliminated for immersion to occur," right? So for me, although I see the rise of these tours, I kind of wish for more or desire more roughness in the sense that I desire more a certain kind of reflexivity of these works, thinking of themselves as tours or as walks rather than as a kind of mobile theatre that's moving around, right? How does the tour deterritorialize both the site as well as the performance itself, rather than thinking of the performance as simply as this intact thing that moves around to various places? So I just want quickly to end off, I'm going to just outline a few of the propositions that I'm making about friction, right? So on one hand, it's the friction, it's here. It's the friction about the actual and the virtual. Okay, so on one hand, it's about the simultaneous engagement with the everyday space and the subversion of those spaces to the voices, right? So it's not as if when we go to these spaces, we are just automatically in one world or the other, but it's this kind of simultaneous inhabiting of both worlds. Secondly, I want to think about the notion of porosity in these tours, right? How do we consider, and how do we reconsider the positions of these extras, the society of the extras? How do we reflexively create performances or these tours that afford those kinds of openness to be directly engaged? How do we think about discomfort, right? So again, anyone who have gone through participatory works will understand that discomfort is a huge part of these works, right? Or awkwardness, like even if it's just the awkwardness of I refuse to go out to these open spaces, I don't want to participate in these things, or you're kind of thrust into this environment and you're like on this secret game of trying to hunt for clues, and everyone else in the public are watching, like, what are these strange like aliens doing, right, and invading these spaces as well. The fourth point, thinking about the friction between the public and the private, right? How do we consider who is setting those parameters about the privatization of our experience of public spaces, the fragmentation of the guiding voice, so that's kind of a point that was brought up, especially in the example of the tour for Holland Village, and the sixth point about thinking about voids as well, the voids in these tours, right? So beyond thinking simply about the narrative stops in a tour, how do we consider, and thinking about sites as these empty spaces to be filled in, whether it's of loss, and especially this rhetoric comes out a lot in thinking about heritage as well. What is the memories or what are the things that are lost and are absent, right? So how do we reconceive these spaces not as sites of voids, but almost in a sculptural way, thinking kind of subtractive sculpture, right? That this is a found world. How do we dramaturgically sculpt these spaces into these performances? So, okay, I will end here. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Breathe. Okay, on that spirited note, can we move on to, we're going on to Rachel first, right?
We just have a little tech change.
Yeah.
I guess during the tech change, I'll just make one more point. I think what I'm also proposing is, I think why we think of this notion of gaps and voids is because we are always thinking about the form of the script, right? So how do we think about tours with choreographic forms, basically, and thinking about the movement of bodies? So instead of thinking about these a narrative story that has a beginning and an end, how do we think of it as a kind of landscape where everything is presented already, right? And therefore audiences have very diverse ways of engaging with these experiences and drifting through these experiences as well. So,
well, we're still working on technicals. Don't worry about it. I already want to plant a thought in terms of linking David's presentation to what Shawn is talking about. The one thing that I pick up on is motion. The idea of motion and these bodies, right? These bodies that David talked about in terms of bodies of democracy and ways of listening and then moving. And then now you are talking physically moving. But the moving here is quite contrasted with the fact that there is no agency. For me, yeah, so I'm already thinking of that kind of links, but just as a start point. So now I'll pass it on to Rachel, where we go deeper to another realm.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on Kaurna land. I acknowledge their elders, past and present, their continuing survival. I'd also like to acknowledge that some of the work I'm talking about today was created on Yaru country in the far northwest of Western Australia, and I'll be talking about a very unsettled moment of my own that happened on Badi country quite recently. So, yeah, I'm going to kind of, in sharp contrast to Shawn, I'm going to tell a very small anecdote of a very little moment in the hope that this little moment kind of has a whole lot of worlds within it. So I'm just going to show you an image of part of that moment. When we started an email discussion, a kind of fragmented email discussion about 4 weeks ago, Shawn sent an email and said that he was going to talk a bit about these tours in Singapore and the idea of multiple gazes working in different directions in the tours. And right at that moment, when I downloaded that email, I was in a remote community called Adyaloon, or Wanam Point, which is, so for those of you who aren't from Australia, if you know where Perth is, which is on the west coast of this enormous country, and then you get in a plane and you fly 2.5 hours north of that, you get to Broome, where our company is based. And then if you get in a 4-wheel drive and you drive 4 hours north of that up the Dampier Peninsula, you get to Adyaloon. And then if, like I had to do, you climb up the hill to the lighthouse where you can get some phone reception. Then I downloaded his email. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about this little moment about dramaturgies in public spaces and being there in Badi Jawi country. We were presenting the first night of a 5-week tour that finished last night in Canberra, actually, of Gudirr Gudirr, which is performed by my co-founder and co-artistic director of Marrugeku, Dahlia Pigram. I think of the work as a duet with the video art of Chinese Aboriginal artist Vernon Arkey, and I'll be talking a little bit about his work in here. I was the dramaturg on this particular work, and I worked in collaboration with senior Yarru lawman Patrick Dodson, who works, you know, along with David. I think that the dramaturgy, everyone collaborating on the work works on the dramaturgy of the work, including the dramaturg. And in our company, we've never been able to have a singular dramaturg work on the piece. We always have different people that work on the dramaturgy in different ways. So Patrick doesn't like to be called a dramaturg because he says he didn't study dramaturgy, but we understand that he is working on the dramaturgy of our works. So I just wanted to talk about this little moment when I had I was thinking about Shawn's email, and I had this rush of memories assault me in a very unsettled moment. I was standing a few metres back from the audience in this performance, taking place on the basketball court of the local school in Adyaloon. I was between this audience, the audience that was sitting on the court or had brought their camp chairs, and the other audience that were sitting in the bushes further back behind the performance area. And I was kind of very nervously back there, A, because Dahlia and I were quite freaked out, to be honest, about presenting this work in the community, and B, because there were a lot of camp dogs around, and I was trying to work out if I was going to have to go on stage and chase the camp dogs away from Dahlia, and Dahlia and I are both terrified of dogs. So I was kind of standing back there sweating because I was like wearing my city jeans to try and fend off the mosquitoes and the sandflies, but I was way too overdressed for the temperature. Adyaloon is a tiny community of about 400 people, as I said, right up in the northwest, and we had performed there for the first time 2 years earlier. The first night we performed there with Cut the Sky, which is a fairly large piece which deals with indigenous perspectives of climate change. The people in the community drove past, we were in the same site, drove past in their cars, kind of peered out the window, had a look, but very few people stopped and almost no one came to see the first performance. The people that did come, I had kind of been careful to get the production manager to put a lot of light for the audience kind of in the space in front of the show, and the people that did come stayed a long way away from that light and sat back in the bushes, kind of a bit behind where I was there. The next night, the cars drove past again, people stopped, and I think about 50 people watched, so maybe 30 people watched the show the first night, about 50 the second night, and now this night, 2 years later, there were about 120 people there, which was very exciting for us. So the show starts with a scrolling text, which I'm going to show you here. As probably many of you know, Broome has a very special history in this country because it was exempt from the White Australia policy due to the pearling industry. So there was a lot of interracial relationships between various Asian indentured workers in Broome and the local Aboriginal communities. However, you know, what was often seen as quite a utopia existed under an incredible amount of government control, and this text written by this travelling inspector who was writing to the very ironically called Chief Protector of Aborigines, A. O'Neville, a eugenicist and a very evil man, was describing the people of these relationships as a possible race of domestic slaves for the white people up there. The kind of intensity of performing Gudirr Gudirr for this community is that a lot of the people there on that night are descendants from these relationships. They're descendants from this era, and Dahlia, in fact, had spent quite a lot of time in that community as a young person in that very school, and there's a closeness and an intimacy, I guess, that I wanted to talk about in this context in terms of a touring work and how these kind of multiple gazes work in different directions in terms of the people in that community, their own experience of the content the work's presenting, and Dahlia performing it that night. So throughout the work, Vernon Arkey's video portraits, and I'll just show you a few images of Dahlia performing the work here. They're not from that night. Vernon Arkey's video portraits of people from Broome of mixed Asian and Aboriginal descent flicker on the harsh corrugated iron video screen. They look back at the audience. In this community tonight, the portraits include family of audience members, people who have attended this school, including one Malaysian Aboriginal man who died on the road into the community 2 months earlier. We've carefully negotiated permission to show his image on the night at the request of the family. To my mind, these portraits are also looking back to the letter from the opening scene. They stare back with resistance and survival across time to the genocidal policies implemented by the government in this state and the incessant control of people's lives. So here too, although this is not a roving public performance, the gazes are moving in multiple directions. And here in Adyaloon, the reverse gazes share an intimate space, a closeness of bloodlines and shared experience. This community at the tip of a tiny peninsula, home to pearl farms and mangrove systems, shares Broome's mixed Asian Indigenous identities and the legacy of government policies. Dahlia's created a specific scene in the performance in response to her experience of the tide turning in the community in the 80s. And as I stood and sweated and Dahlia performed a show that I've witnessed at least 40 times myself, I had flashbacks of other audiences in other locations. They were also very present to me that night. I was thinking of the shows in Broome, just 4 hours away, or of Sydney and Melbourne, of Luxembourg, of Ludwigshafen in Germany, where moving speeches were made, still filtered through anthropological intent. They spoke of acknowledging the suffering brought about by colonisation. In Bruges in Belgium, where I felt a wall of resistance to the experience, of London on the land of the colonisers, of Toronto, where the resonant pain brought out strong responses from those audiences, and of New Caledonia, where Vietnamese Kanak audience members came up to speak to us of their own experience. And also of performances in the Kimberley in other remote communities like Fitzroy Crossing and Moamjum, which also contribute directly to the suicide statistics the work addresses. In these communities, I sensed a similar stoicness as the audience here, a squaring up to the content of the work, a preparedness to meet it face on, as there is no escape from the epidemic facing their own young people who look at them in the face every day. So while I was thinking about Sean's email in the dark behind the show, I could feel how the work's construction has had to open its arms to multiple publics, to function in different ways, to do different things in different contexts. Night after night, Dahlia's greatest gift to the audience in each location is to allow herself to feel the material she's delivering, offering the audience, no matter where they are from, the possibility of observing in solidarity the grief and pain and suffering on hearing the appalling statistics the show imparts. And so as I reflected on the demands on dramaturgies for touring works, I thought about how it must create a paradoxical space to acknowledge the differences in the gazes, to work them differently, to literally do different things in different contexts, frequently accepting the shortcomings of what we can deliver in any particular space, but at the same time to make space for a common humanity that reaches across the distance of difference, to create a space for solidarity, for listening and for growing knowledge. And I just wanted to leave you with this slide, which is of the dress rehearsal the night before that night I was talking about, where 6 boys from the local community wandered in to watch. It's their school grounds, after all. It's their country. There's no walls. And the traditional owners, and one thing I wanted to say was that to perform in these remote communities, we have quite an extensive process of negotiation with the traditional owners of the country. The content of the work is very thoroughly discussed with them beforehand. And this piece, includes a polemic on decolonisation for Aboriginal people themselves, facing change themselves. It includes Dahlia's beautiful kind of embodied Asian indigenous dance language that she presents. It includes video footage of young men fighting each other violently and children filming the footage ostensibly to put it on Facebook and create further humbug, which is a practice that happens up there quite a lot, and an extreme rant that anyone who's seen the show will know, including a lot of expletives. And the community decided, yes, this is absolutely content deemed suitable to be performed in our school. So these young fellows wandered in, they watched the show. It was perhaps the most intimate public space that the work had been performed in. And I listened in as Dahlia spoke to them after the performance, wondering what they would ask about. One of the boys asked, "Was that a true story?" And he was talking about the fishing story that Dahlia tells in the show. And she said, yeah, she tells the story in Aboriginal English in a local Creole. And she said, yeah, that was when me and my dad went up to Bard Creek, which is not far away from that spot. He said, did your dad's arm get stuck down that crab hole? Asking specific details about the use of the crab hook when catching the mud crab in the local way. No, she says. What do you reckon, she asked. Little bit weird? Little bit, said the boy nonchalantly. Little bit weird. And in his voice I heard how this contemporary dance work, very likely the first dance piece he'd ever really seen, contemporary dance piece, really wasn't that very weird for him at all. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank ADN for inviting me here. After sitting through 2 days of conference where you sit there and, passively taking in informations at a level that seems far away and foreign to you, coming here is really quite a comfort.
I'm gonna give it context again. A few of us here from Australia and from Singapore participated in quite a momentous forum for 2 days, which was an Australian-Singapore forum for and with cultural leaders, and it was called the Cultural Leadership Forum, where people were gathered to sort of talk of possibilities of furthering networks, cooperations, collaborations between artists in all forms and genres.
Thank you. I felt a lot of resonance when David was speaking, as well, and of course also Rachel. Some of the things I think probably will appear here, but in my own way. And I hope maybe then from there we can have more conversations on it. I'm from Drama Box. I'm the artistic director of the company. We started first actually as a Chinese language theatre company. For the very simple reason was I feel more comfortable in that language. That's my mother tongue is actually Cantonese and Teochew. And however, I'm more comfortable in Chinese language because I learned that in school. And so I felt that there was a language that connects to me rather emotionally. And at the same time, I wanted to do my plays for my parents to watch because they don't quite agree to me doing to the theatre. So that doing that in that language will help. But well, my dad still didn't see my play. Well, this is my company. I'm the only guy there. So it's a company whereby we work quite collaboratively. However, we've been going through a lot of changes also because of how the company has changed over the years. So we started from being a Chinese language theatre company, and over the years, actually, we find that the more socially engaged kind of theatre works that we do, you realize that in order to create that kind of dialogue in Singapore, you probably cannot work with just one language, and neither can you just work with two languages. I always think that there is a myth or even a kind of a belief that bilingualism is actually what would help Singapore, Singaporeans communicate. But my sense, in actual fact, is actually much more diverse. And in fact, I think the multilingual, the ability to actually handle more languages or the different languages existing is actually much more real than one would believe it to be so. Now, I will start with, so we've been around for about 25 years, and actually the last 15 years, we've gone through quite huge changes. And I'll start with a very, quite a quick description of a piece that we just did. It was done in 2015 as part of a Singapore International Festival of the Arts. It was part of there was a trilogy, which we were looking at land contestation in Singapore. As you know, Singapore is small, so which means that how the land is being used has always been an issue, and all land belongs to the government, and so that's where the power concentrates. So power and legitimization all comes within it, and land is one of the critical issue there. So in that particular piece, we're looking at one of the very, very old cemetery that is in Singapore, and which house about 30,000 graves there. And yet 30,000 graves there is right in the center catchment of Singapore, and it's a beautiful place. It's called Bukit Brown, and it has a lot of old cemeteries there, have a lot of our previous ancestors, and those are luminaries, and they've been buried there. So the government wanted to build a new road across, which will then, they will have to excavate about 3,000 most beautiful graves there at one of the most beautiful parts of this area. So at that time in 2015, the context is the government has just finished an election, losing some seats for the first time, about some 7 seats for the first time. That for Singapore political situation, that was really an earthquake for the ruling party. So, and then they started to promise the possibility of actually having more dialogues, especially with Singaporeans, and they started this whole exercise called Our Singapore Conversation. So when this incident happened, there was this attempt to want to have conversations with the NGOs there, the non-governmental organization who looks at heritage, to see how they could actually mitigate, the damages. However, I think the heritage groups, for them, any excavation would be a harm that cannot be undone. And I think both started at the wrong footing. And in the process, the discussion, the negotiation broke down to a point whereby there were a lot of conversation, or I won't say conversation, a lot of posting that happens on Facebook, that you find the government, the minister involved, finding that the NGOs were difficult to manage and felt betrayed by the NGO. The NGO felt that the government was not sincere in the dialogue. So I decided then to do a piece on that, of which I did an early morning piece at 5:30 a.m. in the morning, where you go to the cemetery and you do a completely movement piece with no words and end with a piano. And as the lights come, you would then see 2 parts of Bukit Brown. One part where it's scenic and beautiful, and the other part where hoardings are up and you can imagine where all the excavations and the building will happen. And then in the evening, we'll have a verbatim piece, which I was quite fortunate that I had this opportunity to actually interview the NGOs as well as the minister, who wanted to have his say about what happened in this incident. So we had this verbatim piece in the evening in the theatre that talks about this issue. I felt that wasn't enough, so then I designed another piece with another colleague, which we wanted to engage the public to not just talk about. I think when things happen in theatre, because of the size, the number of people and accessibility, you probably will only reach out to a particular group of audience. But by having another piece in the public outdoor venues, in community spaces, you actually then invite, you actually get other kind of audience. And that was this piece, The Lesson. Now, it was actually a very interactive work that sets up a fictitious scenario that the government has decided to build a MRT station, or what we call a subway station, in a mature estate in Singapore. So 7 existing sites were earmarked as possible sites for the new subway station. The 7 sites were: 1, an old temple that housed a columbarium where people would put their ashes in the urn there. Secondly, a cluster of one-room flats that are usually for the poorer people or elderly. The third site would be a marshland with a wonderful biodiversity. The next site is a wet market, which is where locals would usually gather and have, a lot of interactions. And one more site that they have, which is a halfway house, that have, this halfway house where the people there have been operating there for some time, and then a hospice, and an old cinema that has become a weekend or evening haunt for foreign workers, where they will go there in the evening after work or during the weekends. So what happened here is that representatives of residents from the estate will have to vote to decide which of the 7 sites to be removed so that this new subway station comes in. However, their votes must be supported by Singapore public, which means they have to get the Singapore public to agree to their decision. Of course, this is a scenario that we set up. We sort of set up this design, this setup. Now, who are these representatives of residents and public? They were actually, just audiences. The representative of public were actually people we made an open call, and they will come to us, and about 15 of them would come for every night, and we will give them a briefing about 1 to 1.5 hours to explain what the whole thing is like, and with information about the 7 sites and the history, and we want them to actually assume their own self to come for the performance. And so when the performance come and the public will come, then they will all sit together to deliberate this. So there is always a structure within it whereby there was voting, argument, discussion, even articulating your needs to the point that everybody must vote. First, the residents must vote. If they have agreed to remove a particular site, then they must persuade the Singapore public, who are the other rest of the audience, to go with them. If not, the final decision will go back to the government. This piece was also incidentally performed in 2015, and that was when there was an election. And that was actually very exciting for us because as people were voting, talking about what is it that we need as a community, they also started to think about what it means when I need to go to the polling station the next day to vote. What kind of a governance do we want? And how should we be represented? Now, so every evening, we have artist facilitators, and so they would debate, argue, negotiate, lobby, contest, and then vote. Every evening, different outcomes would emerge, but in the process, the facilitations would allow the participants to ponder on issues like democracy, community needs, inclusions, privileges, and entitlements, among others. In fact, SHAWN has actually done a study on some of the votes that happened that shows some very interesting data on how people vote according to their ethnic preferences, or even the kind of background that it comes from. As a company, we do not see theatre as a kind of as a product of transaction or of entertainment. We think that in theatre there's actually a building of relationship, but at the same time, I would say as what Rebecca Sonnet put it nicely, whereby the purpose of activism and art is to make the world in which people are producers of meaning, not consumers. As a company, we believe that theatre can make audience see world with a critical lens and to ask questions about what they have seen. In other words, if I may quote or I may borrow from Jacques Rancière, where he talks about that aesthetic experience is a shifting of sensibilities, where what you usually do not see or has been there but not noticeable to you because of the aesthetic experience now become seen and visible. What you have not heard or have heard but made no sense to you now become audible and you are listening to them intensely. Then what was previously not felt, not sensed, or you have been insensitive to it, now becomes real and alive. And art, a lot of time, activate our memories. And that memories could be narratives of stories or emotions that may have been locked or forgotten or blocked out. It helps us to remember, to break us from this, which I think is very important, especially in Singapore, the plague of amnesia, where we would have forgotten and a lot of time because of the comfort that we have that is provided a lot in Singapore, that you tend to forget many things of the past. And all this amnesia actually serves to desensitize us, making a lot of things that are visible becoming invisible. Of course, heard become unheard. At the same time, the imaginative play in the art inspire one to think about possibilities, and which I believe the power of imagination gives hope. So art, which evoke this aesthetic space of memory and imagination, shift sensibilities, inspire hopes and imagination. One of the theatrical forms that we use a lot is forum theatre. I think a lot of people would know what the form is like, where it's interactive, but it is at the same time shifting passive spectators into what you call as spec actors, or some would call the emancipated spectators. And the purpose is to rehearse possible changes and transformations on stage. Forum theatre tells stories about people at the margin, at the edge. It could be elderly who are alienated in our fast-changing society, the youth at risk, the foreign workers who have been exploited by employers, or sex workers who have been put to health risk as well as discrimination. And these are the topics that we have dealt with. But what we also do is that with the permission of the community, we would put this work in the public space, in the open. And that's where it becomes sensitive and difficult. That's why the title, At the Edge in the Open. There is this ethical consideration that when you put this community and their stories out in the open, would you put them into close scrutiny, and how would they feel about it? But I have my own reason for doing it, where I will articulate these few reasons. First, especially a lot of time, the marginalized or those people at the edge always need to feel that they are alone, that they have to face the problems themselves. I think as sociologist Ulrich Beck has noted, social problems are experienced as individual rather than a collective. And we feel compelled to seek what he calls as biographic solutions to systemic contradictions. So which means the individual, it becomes an individual issue because you're not capable, you're not disciplined. That's why you cannot fit into the system, that's why you fall out of the system. So a lot of time the marginalized are actually being being reinforced, told that actually the system is working perfectly well. It's just that you just need some help. And what we do is that we create safety net for you to continue to be in that. In that sense, a lot of time this kind of narrative that is provided a lot of time by the government would actually isolate the marginalized even more, making them feel even more alienated. In fact, sometimes it will make them doubt whether their capabilities to solve the problems. If this persists, many may not even want to reach out for help and risk even being even furthermore isolated. And even when agency extend help, it only further entrench the ideas that the issues lies with the individual failing. By individualizing the issues, the systemic problems is not examined. And the marginalized are seen as a liability to the society, the people who falls out of the system, feels that they are basically ineffective. And that is why we felt that it was important then, at the same time, to also realize that this kind of systemic thing is not just perpetuated by the government, but we, the others to the margin, the marginalized, equally perpetuate such impressions by not being able to see all these issues that are happening around us. So after negotiation with the community, and then when we are able to come to a kind of agreement, then we will have put all the stories in the open, so that we would like also the other community to see that they are part of this systemic issue of oppression that happens. And of course, one way to break away from such isolation and alienation is to form alliances. And alliances can happen between people of the same community. But at the same time, it should also happen with people outside of this community, so that again, this community doesn't feel really very isolated. But the choice to make these stories open means that we have to ensure that there's a safe space for the public to want to participate, or the community feels that they can talk about the issues that they have. And that is something that we have to work a lot on. And I think there are a number of ways that actually we approach it. One, I think as you would know that, having the safe space means that, what does having a safe space means? For me, I think we all would agree that having a safe space means the possibility of us being able to agree to disagree, being able to contest, and being offended. Singapore is a strange place whereby we feel very uncomfortable being contradicted and being offended. Now, and the current narrative that we have in Singapore has always been this, and it comes from the government, to collaborate, to be cohesive, to have social and communal bonding. And in fact, this is the narrative that now this government has been using and hoping that all this will do. However, I think Jakarta Soren Sil has also put a very interesting thought to this, whereby if art is summoned, then to put its political potentials at work in reframing a sense of community, mending the social bond. Once more, politics and aesthetic vanish together with in ethics. Which means, in the word or in the name of creating social bonding, you may then not look at the systemic issue that exists there. Now, so which means, how do we then also create a safe space where we can have contradictions, contestations, disagreements, and dissensus? And that's where in forum theatre, whereby the work of a joker in forum theatre becomes very interesting. Boal described the joker as a difficutator in one of my conversations with him. And I like that word because, or I think Charlene has used this word, pengganggu. Indonesian. Yeah. Which means you are actually complicating the problems or making it actually difficult so that we will be confronted and not just take an easy solution. And it's always very easy to say, I respect you and you respect me, and say that is empathy. I think that's empathy working at a cognitive level. But empathy must work at an emotive level at the same time. But because we are so clever and intelligent nowadays, and most of the government are so intelligent, they rationalize it with empathy, but in a very cognitive way. And if you do not experience the anxiety of the marginalized, it makes it very hard for you to make a decision in their shoes, from their perspective. It's easier for you to then go back to say, because I understand you, but this is where our position is. But I heard you, but is there real hearing, real listening? Now, so in forum theatre, you have the joker that actually create this very interesting space that allow difficult, conversations to happen. So that's one. And that is something that we've been using a lot in our work, including the lessons, where the facilitators will constantly be the one, the moderator, which somewhere quite like what David Pleasure was talking about in his work, whereby the moderator must be able to navigate, to challenge, to sometimes be the listener, but sometimes to be the challenger. The other aspect of it, which I think is important, is that you need to create a kind of a public space that is safe and yet open. And to do it in open public space can sometimes be a problem. Just like you have to negotiate with the First Nation people when you're using their space, we have to negotiate with the government in using their space. They were always afraid that when you have too much of the people gathering together, it may become a riot. This is how our shows look like in our earlier days. You can see that there is actually a simple setup, and we never do a raised stage. It's actually on the floor, and then people will be sitting around. Just like, Rachel's experience, the first time we did it, we didn't understand space, and we put it on stage, and people will just sit far away, and they just do not want to engage. As years goes by, we started to navigate the space. We look at human traffic. We look at how people move. We look at how people are placed. If there were already wooden chairs that were sold at that location, we would make sure we would hide that. Because if you put my stage here and assuming that some people will sit there and watch, in the end you will create a void here because no one will come in there. So we actually have to keep negotiating with that physical space so that it can be open. But at the same time, how to create such a way that it also become a very close and yet very warm space where people can talk and argue and be honest in the process. Of course, the Joker play a very important part of this process, but creating that warm space is also equally important. Now, and nowadays what we find is that, in fact, even for my company who have been doing it for so many years, and even when I am a nominated member of parliament, I would have some government or some community or some estate who would be rather worried about us putting our work there. And they'll be saying that, I don't think I want this company there because they'll be raising difficult questions. And we still have to navigate in that process. Currently, what we have just created is this huge inflatable thing called Goli. It houses about 150 to 200 people. What it does is actually it brings a lot of eyeballs. So whenever we set it up, and it takes about 12 people, it's about 1 ton. And when you set it up, you actually get the public and the community, engaged just by the setting up. And then they will be asking you what is happening, and then they start joining you in the process. It's designed such that it is open, yet it is closed. And it's very useful for us to use it as an installation, but at the same time, for some difficult work that we feel that in a way that audience must feel comfortable to be in. So the lesson is actually done inside there to allow openness, certain porousness, but yet at the same time, it also allow the people inside there to feel that they are in a control, I won't say a control, but a safer environment for them to actually dialogue. Now, the last thing I want to say is the work. Another work that we do that also articulate our approach is actually an idea I borrowed from Mark Tay from Malaysia. He talked something about a multi-plug. And I thought that was a very interesting idea. Because of some of the topic that we deal with, for example, end of life. It is a very complex topic that deals with healthcare, social services, individual values, social systems, political systems. And to make one play about it, to address it, becomes difficult. So the multi-plug then would then mean, from that same source of the topic, how do I actually create different kind of modular performances, installation, different discipline, so that it engage people at different level based on different topics. So in this project, both sides now, which started in 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, for 6 years. Well, it's going into the it should end in 2019. The operation has always been like that. The topic of end of life, but it engages audience at different level, from simple interactive activity to talks, to performances. But importantly, there was an element that I thought was very important, was to create spaces for people to speak. Actually, it's more for people to be listened to, which I would call in our work that listening aesthetic, which I think is sadly lacking a lot of time in the world that we live in. We work with a lot of facilitators, and then we would work with them, train them, help them, so that they are always in the sight. And whenever any audience encounter any of this work, it's not just the encountering that becomes important, but after the encountering, the conversation that this audience would have with our facilitators became part of the performances. And within the design of the space, we will always constantly be looking for white space, such that they would feel comfortable sitting down just to speak to our facilitators, and they will be listened to. And in the listening, we then decide what we can do. And we will have social workers, we have different people over there to actually help them to navigate that process. So this listening aesthetic becomes very important in the way, especially when we are looking at these end-of-life issues, where in the end, we are dealing with actually a very big taboo subject in Singapore, especially for a lot of Asians. And it is not just about dying, but a lot of time it deals with their personal values, and how their personal values has a lot of time also be in contestation with the political and the cultural landscape. Yeah. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The presentations took a bit longer, but I think it was necessary in terms of trying to understand the different contexts and situations and cultural and social spaces that we're talking about. One very quick observation, the three, is that when I started the conversation going with the three of you on emails about public spaces, I did have an amendment saying, okay, let's talk about publics then and not just the physical space. But what was interesting was that all three presentations actually had a quite important, essential things to say about dramaturging physical spaces that then allow for the dramaturgy of emotions, of thoughts, of politics, of desire, of all these kinds of intangibles, as we call it, to emerge from the kinds of works that were created or that were observed. And it's always obviously most apparent in what Heng Leun is talking about, just getting to know the space, navigating the space, physical space of the Singapore public, and then then linking it to Rachel, where I now have a different sense of what we mean when we say the marginalized. Is really pushing the margins geographically. Coming from Singapore, one margin to another margin is 45 minutes away. Yeah, so it is really a political margin that we're talking about, but in the works that you do, it spans physical space, and then psychical, and then going into the politics, and then the social and the cultural. And then with SHAWN painting this picture of the touring, yeah, which is very urban-centric in a way, and looking at the aesthetics of these urban centers and how then they're responding, or how artists are responding to it. Again, it's creating these spaces that allow for political ideas to come out, allowing different ways of social commentary even. But it all seems to start with actually creating a physical space, first and foremost. And that, to me, is quite apparent here, which was also quite interesting. Anyone would like to pick up and talk a bit more, or have any other questions for each other about what we've been hearing and looking and seeing?
I guess I'd like to say that we actually perform in theatres quite a lot, but all of our works are designed to also be able to go into remote communities, and so that I'm not we're not normally considered public space artists, which I think was the first thing that I said to you, but the communities that we engage with are our publics, I guess, more than a kind of spatial relationships. However, technically, like the lighting designers have to make a lighting design that has an A, B and a C version. And although I showed a space that did have some overhead options, all our shows are designed to not have that as well. So there's a big focus in the design of taking that on board from the beginning. But I think, in a sense, I was more picking up on the idea of the tour, but thinking about how it affects a company that tours a lot into a lot of different publics and a lot of different situations around the world, and the kind of impossibilities but also the possibilities of dealing with that, and how that has shaped, fundamentally shaped the dramaturgy in our work, and the collaborations within the work to, from the outset, be able to be thinking of creating a work for multiple publics and multiple points of view and multiple national experiences, looking back into the work. And we frequently, I think every work we've made, at least in the last decade and a half, we've had collaborators from the northwest of Australia, from remote communities, collaborators from urban centres, and collaborators from Europe and West Africa. So the people are always talking about what they see and what they don't see, more often what they don't see and don't understand in the work as we're making it.
The unseen.
Yeah. And I think our work has been shaped just by the fact that we exist to break down walls between remote and urban contexts and between national and international perspectives, and that has driven the dramaturgy in our work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really arrested me was when you're talking about the opening of multiple publics and the feeling paradoxical spaces, right? I think the notion of the paradoxical spaces is perhaps like what maybe I was trying to fuel towards in thinking about roughness and friction, because I guess something that's that I'm slightly alarmed by is how these forms are very quickly co-opted by like Singapore Tourism Board or Singapore Heritage Festival, right? These notions of, or these particular rhetorics about fetishizing authenticity, locality, heritage, etc. And and so for me, the strategy that resists that is roughness, right? To question the kind of smoothness of these narratives. I guess a term that sometimes comes about is a notion of resistant immersion, right? So you're not completely immersed into this smooth virtual narrative, but you're kind of encouraged to find these ruptures, to think about the paradoxes, and then to question how are you positioned within these communities. So just to give a bit of context as well, I think in our initial email thread, I mean, one of the points that I was drawn towards but didn't really manifest in the frantic presentation was this conversation about how does the tour mark our relationality, right? Because by calling it a tour already, it marks that we are going into a kind of exotic space, right? And this is and we are foreign to it, and so that already creates a certain kind of dynamic that's there. And then how does the site unchart our experience as well? I think that's something that I'm very curious about. What are all these different, this very dense field of gazes that are happening, right? We are looking at the performance, at these the performance frames absorbs that world, right? Like a random passerby who is going past becomes absorbed into the performance frame. The shopkeeper, becomes a kind of denizen of the site and becomes an extra, right, so to speak. So do they have a voice? Do they have an agency? How do we acknowledge that sometimes very contentious relationship, or do we ignore them? How do we become very acutely aware that we are also being watched, right? Especially when we're forced to also perform for them as well. So I think that was the space that that we alluded to and you were responding towards. Yeah.
In terms of Singapore urban planning, we all know that it's very planned. everything is calculated to the nth degree by URA, the Urban Renewal Authority. Redevelopment Authority, sorry. That to me is interesting when your works, Heng Luan, when you talk about going into these spaces, so it's already it's supposed to be designed to facilitate community building from an urban planning point of view. Yet there are all these obstacles that you talk about, you know, wooden chairs, and then it creates void, or it creates a unfriendly space. I'm curious, has anyone from URA come to your performances and go, why did we not think of that? In terms of galvanizing a more warm, as you said, a warmer social space. Or has anyone come from URA and said, this should be looked at?
No. But nowadays, they are more interested in the way we do our engagement, so they do come and look at our work and say, can I borrow your engagement approach? Sometimes without permission. Yes, they will.
Yeah.
However, I think in terms of architecture, I mean, that's actually a very interesting question, because it also goes with the way how this government thinks. I think in that kind of a big infrastructure, the government want to have their own say in how to do it. And they always take that, you know, big picture from there on top. And so a lot of times the way they designed, I would say that, you know, they would have the final say, and they would already have their own projections, though they would do quite a lot of consultations. But ultimately, it is a rather, you know, a government who is very sure of themselves in this kind of policies.
Right.
So I don't have them coming to me.
So it's the performance of participation, right? It's again the society of extras. We are creating this dialogue, but it's already determined, etc. So at what point is there? The question that I always have is, you know, there are so many ways in which you can. There are lots of this staging of participation that happens, right? But at what point does it percolate into a real dialogue or a real conversation?
There are things whereby, take for example the end of life issue, when we first started doing it, it was really a commission by two very, I would say, progressive foundations who think that it's an issue that's important in Singapore. So there was no involvement by the government at all. But after the first iteration, the government came, the Ministry of Health came, and they look at it and they say, yeah, I want to talk about it, but as a government, I cannot tell people how to die well, right? So then they decided to inch themselves in a rather subtle way. So they'll say, I'm going to give this money to the foundation. The foundation, you will dispense with the money to the company, but just don't put our name. So that's how they do. So now, and then when they saw the second iteration that it was even more effective, then the next thing they do is that, okay, we want to seed you in your next 3 years of development, but let me maybe do this through the totalizator board, which is like your lottery. Yeah. So the lottery will give us the money, but however, it's actually whatever that they can't give, well, some small amount, just acknowledge a sister organization of this government. Another sex board. So they were injured, and at some point in time, they'll be probably taking over this whole thing and claim it as their own.
They had done for a previous project of yours already, right? Claiming it as their own.
Yeah.
Threading very carefully here, but yeah. Just on another note, Heng Luan, on the 7th and 8th of October in Sydney, there is going to be a festival of death and dying, where they will be looking at cultures of this. It's happening next week. I want to flip the question now back to Rachel. So in terms of the particular project where you went into these remote communities, do you think that such a performance would ever take place in a more urban environment in Australia? Say in the cityscape, would that particular show ever come into the concrete jungle?
Well, the piece has been performed all over the world in multiple spaces, but are you saying not in a theatre? Like, would we
Not
do
in
it
a theatre, in a
outdoors?
public space, and specifically,
Just trying to
that's
think
why I'm
if it
asking
has
about
been.
Australia. I know it's gone out, but here specifically in urban spaces in Australia, and what does that mean? What are the implications of that?
Well, the company began in Western Arnhem Land in a community called Gumbalanya. We were based there for the first 9 years, and there was certainly no theatre or rehearsal room there to work in. And when we moved to Broome in 2003, there was also no venue in Broome for performance, and there was no rehearsal space. We rehearsed in a pandopo kind of space, so there was a roof but no walls. And so those logistical factors defined our early touring works. I think for at least, we're a 23-year-old company, I think at least the first decade we made large-scale outdoor performances and were performed. So they've been, like when they were in Sydney Festival or Perth Festival, they were always programmed outdoors. Europe, it was another situation because the festivals in Europe, the outdoor festivals tend to be places where people like eat a lot of sausages and drink a lot of beer. And kind of often, I don't want to generalise too much, but don't want to think too hard in those contexts. So we found our works falling in the cracks between the kind of, especially, we're not really sure if we're theatre or dance or what we are, but we get thought of as dance these days. And so we were being programmed by the dance festivals, but they weren't programming outdoor work. And then we were being programmed by the outdoor summer festivals, but their audiences wanted to have a really different relationship with the space. So we started going indoors in Europe at that point, but our first decade in Europe we did large-scale outdoor performances for 1,000 people a night, but generally on like a tribune, they call it a tribune. So yes, absolutely, and sometimes they're ticketed and sometimes they're not ticketed, or sometimes they're ticketed and free as well.
Which is why I specifically wanted to know about this particular project with the kinds of themes around it. How would that ever be considered in a city space, say Adelaide, downtown centre, Sydney CBD, or Melbourne CBD?
I can certainly imagine it being in a public space. Gudirr Gudirr is a kind of very focused and distilled work. It's a solo. There's a real intensity about it. So, in Adyaloon, I didn't actually have to chase the camp dogs off the stage, but when we did cut the sky there, the final scene, if any of you have seen it, it rains on stage in the final scene, and the dogs were like in there lapping all the water up. And there's a lot of kids running around in those shows in Adyaloon, so there's a lot of, it's busy. I think we can, she's amazingly tough. She can kind of cope with a lot happening around her, so I can imagine that happening. But I think I guess the question is also about the content and I was trying to stick to my time limit, so I didn't really get to go very deeply into the relationship between the quote that I showed in the beginning and the legacy of that history for young people in the Kimberley now, and the fact that the Kimberley has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. There's a government inquiry going on in the moment at the moment about that, but those suicide statistics are very pertinent there, but they, of course, are also national and they affect a lot of indigenous communities. The piece was performed in the last 2 weeks in Bathurst, Newcastle and Canberra, and they had strong turnouts from the indigenous communities in all of those places and amazing responses to the kind of very visceral nature of the work. So it's not, what we try and do with our work is to create a space where the context of the Kimberley is speaking back to wider global issues that the world is addressing, and that's why we also made a piece about climate change. So we're not making intercultural indigenous work over there to be looked at as something that's over there and far away, but something that's speaking directly back to the issues that the world is dealing with. That's why we really believe in intercultural practice as something that the world needs now, because, you know, the issue of us being able to talk to each other is becoming more critical, like week by week by week, and to create a space where the gaze is going both ways, and the actual dramaturgy of the work demands the audience member to feel their own personal space and relationship to the content, and that often means that we're creating a space that the audience members don't quite understand. And that's a really vital place we talk about a lot in our piece, that people feel the experience of not quite understanding what's happening. And that's actually a really critical space in intercultural practice. And we walk a tightrope in the dramaturgy of our work to create that space and not alienate the audience or alienate them too much. And often working, you know, I'm not Indigenous, and so I won't talk too much about Indigenous knowledge structures, but they can be very enigmatic, and they hide and reveal meaning to different people depending on where they are in terms of initiation, their experience, their age, whether they're male or female. So they're like these kind of incredibly intricate knowledge structures that are both allowing understanding and hiding understanding at the same time. And so our works are often really enigmatic and kind of unapologetically. So we want the audience to experience understanding a bit of what's going on, but not understanding all of what's going on, and how they are, where their position is in their own life and their own knowledge, and how they sit in relationship to that experience. That's a kind of very big picture response to your question. But
Thank you. Yeah. I think at this time I would like to now bring in our audience, our floor, questions, comments on three very rich presentation, but still very interconnected in many ways. Yeah. Do we have any comments or questions to any of our speakers? Yes, Alfian.
Hello. So first of all, thank you very much for such fascinating presentations. I have a question for Rachel and one for Heng Leun. For Rachel, have you ever encountered in doing this kind of intercultural work, as much as I think it's very important to secure the blessings as well as permission of a certain community before doing certain work, but have there been occasions when you felt that there was some censorship that was being exerted? Like, for example, they will say, oh, our people would not wear something like that, for example. And then do you feel like maybe you might need to take sides, because sometimes the artist's work is that of an individual that's trying to transgress or rebel against the norms of that community? So that's the question. Or if you haven't, how would you actually try to deal with that situation in the future? For Heng Leun, it's interesting, you know, we're talking about the public and public engagement, but what if there are instances when, like for example, dealing with death, where there might be communities that don't want it to be public, that want these discourses to be contained within private spheres, then are we sort of like forcing or imposing a certain way to conduct that discourse? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Maybe Rachel should take that first, and then we'll hear from you.
I mean, I would say yes, absolutely. We deal with that a lot. And I think there are really different answers to that question depending on the really specific nature of what's going on. I mean, the first thing I would say is that we've worked very carefully for years to negotiate the experimentation that happens with cultural material in particular, and I'm specifically talking about dance, to really be very, very transparent about the experimental process and to bring elders of multiple cultures and Broome in to look at the work. So that's the kind of fundamental position. But I think more specifically, we leave it up to the people from the specific communities to negotiate with their own community elders and take their own position in response to a specific set of issues. And I mean, one particular example I can talk about right now, which is a very complicated one, but Cut the Sky, our last work, dealt with fracking in particular. And it's an incredibly tense issue in the Kimberley. The Kimberley holds, is the home of the Canning Super Basin. It's now called a super basin. It has, the Canning Super Basin is 1/16 of the land mass of Australia. That's, excuse me, but a fuck of a lot of gas that's under the ground there. That's a huge amount of gas. And so the Kimberley's very isolated. So there's, it's hard to get to this gas, but there's a potential for 100,000 fracking wells there that can be fracked for, 200 years. And the Western Australian legislation, which has actually recently changed with the new government, but while we were making the work, the legislation was that anything under, this is very foreign to an indigenous understanding of land and atmosphere and minerals, but everything under the Earth's surface was able to be taken by government, whether it was a national park, whether it was farmland, station land, or whether it was land under native title. So Edwin Mulligan, one of the collaborators on the work, who's a Walmatjari Nyigana artist from the Central Kimberley, in a part of the country that was negotiating directly with Buru Energy, a mining company, over fracking licenses in their country, decided to tell the dreaming, that's a complicated word, but the dreaming story for the gas in the performance. But that community had decided to go with Buru Energy on fracking, and the mining licenses include gag orders, basically. So if a mining license is negotiated with native title holders in this country, they basically sign a gag order that no one in the community is allowed to stand up and contradict the overarching decision. And Edwin himself had to find, as an artist, and he works, I have to say, very gently, to take a position on what he could say. And we got blowback from traditional owners in that community who had decided to go with fracking, but we also got it from the energy company. But Edwin, we had to really go with Edwin and what he was prepared to say, and his own dialogue with his elders and his family who were against fracking. It's not my place as the director of the work to take a stance on that. It's really creating a space where Edwin can do what he needs to do. But as Marrugeku, we're also having to negotiate that process with the traditional owners of the native title claim to that land. So in any situation, we would visit it differently.
I think every time when you do a piece of work in the open, there must be, at least on our side, we do know that there are some people who may not even want to talk about it. So in a lot of time, one of the things that helps to navigate that kind of sensitivity would actually be how you design the entire space, where it is open yet at the same time quite close up. So people can choose not to enter. And because we do it for free, so people can choose when they do not want to be engaged, tell us and walk off. And of course our facilitators become very important. They will not go out there and say, hey, you want to talk about this? Never. In fact, a lot of time we'll just sit there and wait for them to come to us. I think that bit is where how you actually, again, work with the rhythm of the space. When I say that, I was never too I mean, when you work inside a theatre, yes, you are working with time and space all the time. But when it comes to working outdoor, then that sense was even heightened more than ever. And it became a kind of intuitive things. And there are a number of things you need to consider also. Who gathers in those spaces? And what do they do usually? And where do they gather? And then you have to decide. Take, for example, one of the sites that we're now working at. There was this pavilion, which I've always liked, that pavilion. However, the pavilion has been occupied by this group of women who gambles there every day. And on a weekday,
Sorry,
about 4 to...
when you say pavilion, could you tell us what do you mean by where is this pavilion?
Inside a housing estate, between 2 or 3 blocks. So they have this little garden there, you know, and there is this pavilion, and they inhabit there literally every day for 3 to in the afternoon, and they will gamble there, and we wanted to activate that whole space. Now our problem is, we want to activate the whole space. We couldn't intervene into their space. My question now is, how do I actually start a dialogue with them so that if I want to activate it, would they allow me to do it, though it doesn't belong to them? So they've used the space, they've taken over the space, and even the town council, the local authority has sort of left them be. They gamble on Monday to Sunday, and on weekend, there'll be about 10 to 15 of them. So I think that these are the things that you actually need to do a lot of ground research and discussion and negotiation with a lot of stakeholders around there. And there were people who will say, please do not come. And you just have to respect. But certain things are slightly more sensitive, like faith issue, especially in end-of-life issues. Especially when it comes to faith issues, then we also then have to ask ourselves, the content that we curate inside this program. How is faith being represented, or could it be avoided in some way? But given that, actually that empty space, for allow it to be conversed rather than to put it out. Sometimes making it absent can become a strategy that you use, you know, to actually make that negotiation. So we're constantly looking at this kind of so-called dramaturgy, I would say, how to actually create that kind of absence or presence, and that tension is equally important. Yeah.
Do we have a follow-up question or comment?
Hi, this is not the follow-up question, but actually a kind of minor contextualization to Sean's presentation. This is regards to A Lizard on the Wall, because I'm the aide to the festival director of the festival that commissioned Raja to do Lizard on the Wall, and I don't think that there was ever the intention that it would be more than a situation where the audience became an extra in the film. It wasn't meant as a kind of a touring performance or a promenade performance of sorts. And it was just purely engaging, bring a different set of audience into the performing arts through film. So I just wanted to clarify that. I found it a little bit problematic, I will very honestly tell you, when you use the word that the film was attempting to appropriate authenticity. There was nothing of that. And I'm just wondering how much of a conversation you had with Raja post Lizard on the Wall to reach that particular conclusion. Because all it was doing, it was to make a film like any film director, and that was platform we were all very excited by, as a performing arts festival, to see how we can cross-discipline and how we can actually bring in a film audience into performing arts. And of course, as you know, the Open always had a film program that's curated by BTM. But also this year in SIFA, we have Lav Diaz, who is a major filmmaker, and we've commissioned a film where the audience were actually observing the master at work. Again, the idea of what it means to be a performing arts festival. Is it just a performing arts, or can we be working with film to enlarge that discussion and that space of the performing arts. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you. I think you're right. I never meant to say that it was. I think in the marketing and the framing of the work, it was never meant to be emancipatory or participatory even, right? But I think but what struck me was, in my experience, how Raja started to use that language like very much, and so that was what made me begin to kind of wonder, right? Why are we like hammering so much on this notion of the authentic? Because that never struck me until I went for the tour itself. So I mean, yeah, that was just the point that I was bringing.
But it would be great if we actually had a dialogue.
Yeah.
Because I think that he would have never imagined that to be the effect. I think what could have happened, I mean, for Raja, was to activate the public to become a performer of sorts in the film, and perhaps the choice of words and choice of language to encourage that energy has given you that impression. But it'd be great to actually get the check in, because it'd be interesting to see what you think. Yeah.
I think I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of these thoughts are still like very preliminary, but I think it's really a response to seeing how there is, why are we so, I guess the question behind participatory works is always the demands of the audience, right? Why is there this desire for the audience or on the audience to feel more intensely, to be more involved, right? And what's happening there is the question that I'm wondering about. And I think definitely there are a lot more conversations that can happen, right? With artists who are trying to play with these kinds of works, and also perhaps more reflexivity, I guess more kind of explicit engagement with these works as tours, as walking, as participation, to kind of unpack the strategies that are being deployed here. Thank you.
So I do think, though, Teh Tong, that authenticity sort of haunts that work, because it comes with a kind of baggage. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but they did sort of a reading of Bali Kaur Jaswal's novel, Sugar Bread. And it was such a controversy in Singapore, because the readers were of Indian ethnicity, and they put on very thick Tamil accents, whereas the characters were Punjabi. Yeah, so it speaks a little bit about how in Singapore our notions of Indianness and all that is completely not nuanced and stereotypical. Yeah. Sorry, dear. The reading was done by the people from Epigram Books, her publisher. So I think yeah, it's got nothing to do with you, dear. It's got nothing to do with you. But I did feel then that what you did with Sifa, there was a bit which is a project of redress, that it was so screwed up previously. Let's try to approach something a bit more authentic. So in a sense, couldn't escape that desire to be authentic, or at least to be closer to the subject material, which is Punjabi culture, than that horrible caricature that, yeah.
Sometimes is there really need to look too deeply into that when it was just simply the making of the film? It's just the different
Yes.
on the wall.
Sure.
I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with trying to go further into it, but I think there has to be a certain element of responsibility. And then the critique of this work should have been discussed with the maker of the work, and to investigate the actual intention of the maker of the work.
Right.
Because I've gone through a producer work that has been slammed tremendously by a particular writer of interculturalism who only came in for one rehearsal and wrote a huge thesis of it with no any further discussion with the makers of the work. So I am very wary of such kind of critique and academia. I worry because they're always in a particular position to make a certain presentation, which the reader of the publication or the thesis would have imagined that they will have had some kind of discourse, discussion, research sufficiently deep to come to those conclusions.
So I think, sorry, just a quick response to that. I think Adam Alston, when he talks about immersive theatre, I think one of the things that he is really trying to recuperate is also what's the position of the audience participant in works that are deeply participatory, right? So not specific to Liz on the Wall, because we've established that that's not what it's trying to be. But I think especially in the emergence of these kinds of works that have such a huge or heavy labor demanded on the participant as co-creators, as co-producers of the work, sometimes to complete the work in various ways. I think Adam Alston is sort of talking about, what does it mean to be co-authoring the work in some ways. Again, not in the context of Liz on the Walls, because the script was very much fixed, right? The part of the audience comes in is really just as wedding guests or various forms of extras to have a taste of that world, but not necessarily, there was never a promise that you could change it. So I think that distinction, that critical distinction is very important in this conversation. So, thank you for the clarification.
How about a different question or a different comment to open up some other line of discussion or some other line of interrogation?
Friction is good.
Friction is lovely, but I like a different kind of friction. As Sean has pointed out, yeah. Casey has a...
Yeah, I agree. Friction is useful, and we must all agree to disagree, and this critique it can be in a safe space. Maybe let's take on and move the discussion on another front. May I? I'm just curious. When you talk about the language, right? How even though we're all speaking English, we mean for cultural translation. So I'm just thinking, in general, what in the Australian context, what does when work is socially engaged theatre or work that speaks to the community, what does it mean to you? Because I think it could mean very different to me as a Singaporean watching Singapore theatre. So I'm just curious about that in the context of activating the public and spatial intervention.
Maybe you can start us off by telling us what does it mean for you then, Singaporean?
For me, when the work is socially engaged, it takes on a very risky kind of approach. It touches on things that's it's very tangible and it becomes very real to me. So, for example, when I watched The Lesson in Singapore, I watched it in my neighborhood in Hougang. So it became very real. It's something really, really close to me. So I'm just wondering what it means in the Australian context. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's open to Rachel and the rest.
I could begin that.
Yeah, please.
And it sort of flips into this authenticity stuff as well. And it's the socially engaged work in Australia I see it, and this is a personal point of view, I see it as a volume switch from 1 to 10 around agency. So let's say 10 is where the audience has complete control of the work and the agency and the outcome of the work. And then 1 is where the agency is, sorry, the word is not authentic in a way, but given over as a way to make it fun or participatory. Does that make sense?
What do you mean by to make the work fun?
Oh, I mean, a lot of people say that participatory work is fun. You know, you get involved. You know, like there are works where you tour, and it is not necessarily, the agency is not authentic. You're given a character. You're given something to play out. The end will always be the same. Then there is work where your agency is, let's say, is dialed up to 10, and that is community cultural development work in a way. It's where the agency is given over to the group of participants who are working on the work and control the outcome of the work.
That's one perspective.
That's one perspective.
Would anyone like to chime in or offer a different one? Rachel, perhaps.
think I might have misunderstood your question, but were you asking about language as in, because you said we're talking in English, and are you asking also about what language work is made in here in Australia? Aesthetics, yeah.
Socially engaged to me may seem quite different in the context of Australian theatre making, I suppose. I was curious.
It's a big country and there's a lot of different work being made, but
In your own cities and
yeah, I mean, we're very interested in kind of disrupting and radicalising partially notions about community cultural development, actually, and aesthetics in that context. And part of the way that we do that is we activate spaces of intercultural and international exchange. So we work in a very remote area, but we work with a lot of international collaborators, and we also, for example, we're just about to start working in New Caledonia on a work commission for the eve of the referendum on independence from France there, with a big international project. And one of the aesthetics that's been really useful for us and people find quite kind of surprising about our work is that we work with a number of collaborations with artists from the Flemish Wave in Belgium, because we find that there's something that has come out of this, a very contested nationhood in Belgium that has been sitting behind the Flemish Wave and the aesthetics in that work, that speaks in a very dynamic way in our intercultural practice in the remote far north of Western Australia. So, which is a process, you know, it comes from Bausch and from working with a task-based process where the dancers are working with their own embodiment, their own stories, their own memories and physicalities, and we work with a Flemish process that has a German history in a remote community, and that produces a very specific aesthetic. It's quite raw and rough, and it has a very kind of individual language to it. The dancers will create their own material. It has quite a poetic aesthetic. And so I think that it's important to keep our ideas about aesthetics in community cultural development practice very open and very dynamic, and provoke them and bring in outside influences and work across spaces as well as deeply in spaces. But that's just Marrugeku's point of view. That's a very specific one, but it's a big country, so.
Do we have any other burning questions or comments? I think one of the biggest observations I've had here is that we always think of socially engaged work or performances. We understand and we know the kind of research that goes into it in terms of the content and even in terms of the form of the performance or the event itself. I think what is happening here, what I'm hearing, is that the research actually extends much further and much more layered, from dramaturgies of architecture to even dramaturgies of consultative voices, that extends into, like you said, different structures of knowledge, different ways of system beliefs that go very far different from the original source of the performance itself or the performance maker. And this is interesting because then new ways of researching has to be thought of, and it keeps changing because of the kinds of issues that come out and because of the kinds of spaces that come out that then needs to be readjusted. And then the whole engagement with the social has to always change, even though we keep thinking that the social or the public could be the same target audience, but it's not really, is it? That's for me what I'm hearing at different levels here. Yeah. And on that note, I'd like to please ask you again to give your hands to the two speakers. Thank you very much. And we call to an end for this particular session. We begin again tomorrow at 9:30, where Charlene will give her keynote, followed by another round table, and then we will wrap up with a cross discussion between David and Charlene. Yeah. Hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you.